Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's guest is Heather Brunskell-Evans, who is a Foucault scholar and author and writer. And in this conversation, we talk about Foucault and his usefulness, or certain tools that he developed and their usefulness for analyzing the way in which power operates within modern political discourse. We use that specifically on the transgender movement and the way that the transgender movement is controlling language and shuffling around power by declaring who is the oppressed and who is the oppressor and inverting those. This was a very interesting conversation for me and tests a lot of the critique of Foucault and other postmodern scholars that I have platformed here and perhaps changes my angle just a bit. Let me know what you think. Without further ado, here is Heather Brunskell-Evans. I'd like to get your perspective on Foucault, because I believe I've platformed a number of different critics of Foucault and his network of loosely associated academics from France, whatever.
Yeah.
The postmodernist stuff. So I've had Helen Pluckrose, James Lindsay, and a number of other notable individuals who make an argument that those ideas are at the root or are being weaponized by critical social justice in order to destabilize power hierarchies and ultimately to reshape the world or invert the power hierarchy. So I know that you are critical of their criticism, and I'd like to explore with you Foucault's insights, his worth, and also tie that into the gender conversation too. We meld those conversations together. So that's kind of my... Okay.
How I got involved in all of this is because I am a Foucault scholar. I did my PhD on Foucault. I've taught Foucault for a number of years. And the transgender issue almost fits perfectly the kind of issues which are from Foucault's theory that I found very fruitful and very interesting and very exciting, actually, and intellectually stimulating, because he has the tools to critique transgenderism, because transgenderism is involved with, medicine, which Foucault was very concerned about medicine in its social and political context, liberal democracy, how it is that we often imagine ourselves to be free as liberals and as Democrats, but in fact there are forces going on in the culture of which we need to be aware. And finally, his idea that what power and knowledge relationships do is they construct subjectivity so that at that moment in which we perceive ourselves to be authentically ourselves is probably the very moment at which there are all sorts of things going on, which to do with ethical frameworks, human science knowledge, power relationships, which have helped us get this, or have indeed constructed us, which people find upsetting, and I understand that. That sense of our internal authentic subjectivity. So transgenderism, it was when I started to be interested in it, when it became something that everybody else was interested in, because it became part of public consciousness more in 2016, I idly, in a sense, decided that I would apply a Foucauldian analysis or framework or use his methodological tools to analyze it. And then the rest is history. I got involved in something which I've never actually been able to extricate myself from. So
what was you started speaking out or writing articles or doing papers or writing a book on this, and that just one thing led you to the next?
Yes, there are a series of events which I can tell you about. The first thing was that I wrote an article I was working at the University of Leicester at that time. I was a senior researcher at the Centre for Medical Humanities there. And I wrote an article about Bruce Jenner, because he was on the front. He has that iconic image on Vanity Fair. He was transitioning, although he was fully male-bodied as far as I knew. And he was performing femininity on the front cover of Vanity Fair and performing it such that people actually believed that in some sense he had become truly a woman. And I was listening to your podcast with James Lindsay, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of the person who was with him.
Local distance, yeah.
When they were talking about Baudrillard and Baudrillard, who was also a postmodern theorist. So it's quite interesting for me to hear that James Lindsay was quite happy to use Baudrillard's theories or the concepts that he gave without, one can do this with having to become a postmodernist. So I'm assuming that James felt that he could use Baudrillard's theory without signing up to the whole of postmodernism. So I'm doing the same with Foucault, as it happens. What Baudrillard was saying and what they were quite rightly talking about was the way that the simulacrum of something becomes more real than the thing itself. And I think they were actually talking about sex and gender and that. And they were talking about, maybe I'm putting words into or framing it in my own way, the sort of almost the disappointment men have, because what they have in heterosexual relationships with women is full-bodied human beings, when in fact the simulacrum of a woman is almost more feminine and more appealing perhaps to some men than the actual concrete embodied human being herself. And so that sense, I didn't use Baudrillard, but I could have used Baudrillard, and I was possibly informed by him to talk about how Bruce Jenner was performing femininity, and then he became Woman of the Year. So I wrote an article, to get back to what you asked me, I wrote an article about his performance of femininity and the strange way in which this was more real than women themselves, that society accepted this. But more than that, that's bothering, but it's not crucial to the issue of liberal democracy. What was crucial to me was this idea that we then could not talk about Bruce Jenner as male prior to this alleged transition. So when he was an athlete or when he was fathering his children, we were being told that, in fact, to talk about Bruce Jenner as having been previously male was in some sense an ethical assault on his very being, and that to do it was the crime of the most heinous proportions. So I wrote about this. And then what actually happened was that in fact, what I wrote about was exemplified in my own actual life, because in a couple of days, I wrote about it, I forgot about it. And it was for an internal think piece for academics at the university. And I literally forgot about it until one day, very soon afterwards, I opened my email and I discovered that an academic had made a complaint about it, and had suggested that I had, contravened the Equality Act 2010 in the UK, and that students would be petrified to come to the University of Leicester, even not the students that I teach, any student. It's got thousands of students. And any trans members of staff would be petrified, and that the vice-chancellor might just think about whether I should be employed there. So I lived in, as I said, that exemplified exactly what I'd been trying to analyse. The happy consequence of that is that the University of Leicester behaved very sensibly, but, they sent off my article to their own lawyers for a number of days. I felt quite insecure about my position. There was a whole constellation around that one incident about that we're now is being realised in practice or in real life, about silencing, attempting to shut down not only what you say, but what you think, the necessity for compliance in order to keep your job, and all of those kinds of things. And Benjamin, I could go on about this for years, because from that incident, there have been so many incidents subsequently.
What you're referring to is commonly called cancel culture, and it has ramped up incredibly.
Cancel culture, it didn't exist at that time. This was right at the beginning.
Yeah.
It was like that note when you hear, I imagine, if you hear a tsunami or you hear something rumbling in the distance, something is going on here. What is it that's going on? And of course, the full tidal wave has come over the top of us. But at that time, the concept of cancel culture didn't exist. I'm pointing this out because I think it's important that people realize that this cancel culture that's going on now also has a history to it. It's possible to imagine that somehow it just arose spontaneously. It didn't. It has a whole political history to it. And I'm talking about 2015, 2016, before it really got going. But I was part of that sense. Something really serious is going on here that I've never experienced in my life before.
So
luckily.
This is kind of an older criticism or diagnosis of this network of ideas, to ascribe to them a postmodern sensibility, to say that the people who are promoting, and transgenderism is just one part of it. Also critical race theory, there's all these other different kind of social movements. They're all in a big bag. And what Lindsay and Pluckrose have tried to do is try to kind of consolidate them into this source ideas. And,
they have, and they've done it successfully in many ways.
A destabilizing of language, a very cynical way of dealing with everything as power, and all hierarchies are basically, there's no creative power. It's all very cynical power. It's all usurping. Everybody is, like this master-slave relationship all the way up and all the way down, and it's never positive. It's never distributive in a creative sense. It's always exploitative.
I disagree with that, actually.
Okay, no? Okay. Like, I'm just saying that there's all these kind of ideas to try to figure out why are people acting this way, and is there a framework from which they are operating that would make them act as though to disagree with them is to, kind of somehow tarnish or disrupt or even erase their existence.
You've said a number of things that need disentangling from one another.
Disentangle me. That came out weird. Sorry.
So I will ignore that. I was going to add something else, but you would have had to let it out. So the problem with their thesis is that it has this idea that there's some kind of controller at the top of this, sort of pulling the strings, who wants to be utterly cynical, who wants to undermine, civilization as we know it, as it were. And I think that it doesn't work like that. Having said that, I think that there are people who are utterly manipulative, who are throwing money at this, and we need to look at where the money is coming from, and we need to look at the relationship between transgenderism and big pharma and so on. But if we put that on a shelf at the moment with the acknowledgement from everybody listening that I understand about that, I want to move on to some kind of different terrain here. The problem with the book is that it dismisses the complexity of thought that was postmodernism, which other people have then taken up cynically or reductively or stupidly. Mm-hmm. But to actually target the thinkers themselves and to somehow argue that they have caused this is so reductive in itself. I think that each of those theorists started off a movement which has become dangerous. It has become serious. But in and of themselves, those theorists were quite heavy duty and cynical. I don't know what their actual emotions were, but their analysis of society and the kinds of things that they were problematizing and asking us to think about wasn't because they thought, do you know what, in 40 years' time, I'm going to mess with these people and this is going to be the consequence of it. There was a genuine concern to analyze power relationships, which is what Pluckrose and Lindsay are wanting to do. Yeah. So the little clip they showed of Foucault, where he was talking in advertising their book before it was published about, I can't remember it precisely, but he was talking about the way that in the university, power and knowledge have become so intertwined that it's very difficult to, that what we have to do, we have to apply our critical thought to what passes off as truth and unpick it, disentangle it, is precisely what they are doing. So there's a strange anomaly that they used Foucault to actually almost advertise the very thing that they are complaining about that happens in the university. So, Foucault can be taken, there are many different Foucaults. We could talk about that Foucault or that Foucault over there. But if you want to talk about the Foucault that I'm involved with and that I use, I think that he is, that the tools that he provides you, the conceptual tools, I'm not concerned about him as an individual at this moment in time. The conceptual tools that he provides help us to think about what Pluckrose and Lindsay say he doesn't help us think about. They are concerned with liberal democracy and how it is that we can exercise freedom to the maximum capacity, collectively and individually. It's exactly what Foucault was attempting to do. But what he was attempting to do was to say that when things seem to be transparent, they aren't. So if we want to be truly free and ethical, what we need to do is to unpack the various component parts of whatever the truth is. So if we come back to transgenderism, the fatal flaw, for as far as I'm concerned, because of my own interests in the critical theories book, is that Pluckrose and Lindsay both agree that transgenderism actually exists, and that if we were just tolerant and free, we would accept transgender people. Of course, I don't want to have to defend myself any more about this. I accept people who identify as transgender. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the way that they assumed that transgenderism is a real phenomenon that concretely exists externally to any of the way that we think about transgenderism. And my point is that it doesn't. And the minute that you start to think that, then you end up medicalizing children and the dreadful consequences that occur as a result of it. So I think of Foucault as a very ethical theorist who has given me the tools to think through how a subjectivity, the transgender child, for example, that seems to exist outside of discourse is actually socially constructed. And that in that social construction, once we've grasped that and not fallen to the floor in a faint because somebody has suggested that it's a constructed phenomenon, then what we can do is that we can actually look after or care about the different practices that are attendant upon the idea that the transgender child is a real phenomenon. So I use Foucault in that way and for no other reason.
Why do you think that gender is like, it's almost as if gender it's the most discourse of all discourses. It's almost entirely discourse. And the ticket to get into the conversation is to say, this isn't sex anymore. We're not talking about sex. We're not talking about biology anymore. We're talking about what? Internal feelings constructed out of what?
Yeah.
Like, it's nothing but discourse. And I've watched it, kind of go into the minds of the youth. And what do teenagers do with this? They don't have a sufficient grounding in reality to run their own lives yet. And yet they're already building these castles made out of, fairy dust. That's called gender. And then those citadels of belief are very vigorously guarded by all these institutions, namely academic institutions, are reinforcing this and then policing all this discourse. It seems like the perfect Foucaultian, kind of like thought experiment.
Yeah.
How is that what happened with that?
To use a Foucauldian metaphor, you could use the metaphor of the panopticon, where, in some sense, it's got to a central source where we are like the prison guard, and we're in our little cells, all of us, in various different ways. And the prison guard is telling us that we must believe that transgenderism is a real phenomenon. We were born or not either cis or transgender. And even when the prison guard has his back to us because he's in the center of the prison, even when the guard isn't actually watching us, we have to check ourselves, because any second now he might revolve and be able to see into us. It's astonishing how that has happened. Utterly astonishing how it's happened. So if we want to examine how that's happened, I suggest that using Foucault is a pretty good way of analyzing it. And if you want to look at the people who are manipulating this and who have the central control, you wouldn't go to Foucault. You wouldn't go to any of the postmodernists. You would go to the people who are interpreting whatever they want to from postmodernism. What I think the truth of this is, I think it's a hugely patriarchal, misogynistic movement. And I think we would need to look at the interesting ways in which, at the very moment that women have started to develop or have their rights attributed to them, and some semblance of equality has happened, what has happened is that men are saying that they can be women. So it's a very odd thing. This isn't an equal opportunity thing. It's not some people want to be women, some men want to be women, and some women want to be men, and it's equal. It's really not like that. The people who are being disproportionately affected by the transgender movement are women. That is the reality of it. And so, as far as I'm concerned, it's a kind of patriarchal movement reinvented in 21st century guise. Now, to talk about that, I would need to, or explain why I think that, other than the obvious empirical phenomena, like having to have, for women to have to accept that male-bodied people are actually female and they compete with them as athletes, and all of those things, which we can see quite clearly are unfair. To analyze the behind that, I think we would need a longer conversation that we're going to have here. But I just want to flag up here that it's ridiculous to target any particular thinker from the 1970s or 1980s to explain this. You would have to join up lots of dots as to how we have got here. And my suggestion to liberal thinkers like Pluckrose and Lindsay is to go further back than the 1970s, in fact, and and to look at and to realize, actually, that patriarchy, it's a ridiculous term because it's the rule of the father, and this is, strictly it's the rule of the father, and so it's an inadequate term because it's gone way beyond the rule of the father, but it's a kind of masculine control that's going on. So if you're a liberal who wants to accept that there's such thing as power, and that power works behind the scenes, and that power works to
reinforce itself.
And it's in our personal lives. If you can accept that, which many people can't, but they can, let's look at power then. Let's look at power and the structures of power and how they manifest themselves.
Yeah.
It's
Are
so
those power structures always
Sorry?
Are they always cynical in nature? I mean, are they always exploitative in your conception? Is power purely exploitative?
I think, I'm going to answer in Foucauldian terms now because you've given me permission to talk about
it. As long as you don't do Derridadian, because then I won't be able to understand what you're talking about. But we can do that if you want.
No. I don't want to do Derrida.
You want to do a Derridadaist?
Two things. If you want to problematize postmodern thinking, you are much better to go to Derrida, because Derrida talks about the way that power operates within language. I don't blame him for this. I think he was right. But it's Derrida's thesis, which has been taken by the current transgender ideology much more than the Foucauldian one, because Foucault is very concerned about bodies, materiality, and so on. So they were barking up the wrong tree with him. But anyway, one of the good things about Foucault is that I think that why he was so influential in the 1970s is because he was engaging in Marxism, basically. That was one of his projects, was to engage with Marxism in this idea that although power is hierarchical, it's no good just imagining that power works with a capital P and there's a sort of fat controller at the top manipulating the strings, the puppet master. The way that power is most effective is if people volunteer themselves for the power. They go along with it. They identify with it. And so when I talk about patriarchy, I'm not saying that all men are horrid and wanting to control women and all women are victims of it. In this, the transgender issue is a very good example of it, that in many ways, many of the women who were mobilizing the men's rights movement are women themselves. There are very important female figures in this, Judith Butler being one of them. And there are men who are very concerned about and opposed to it. So when I talk about patriarchy, it isn't a black and white thing, but the reality is that it's women who are being impacted by this and not men. So we live in a situation in which,
I would just have to push back against not being so absolute. There are a lot of men who are being severely impacted by this too. Least of all children. If children, male-bodied children,
of course,
count. Okay,
of course.
Just a small footnote because there'll be a flood of comments that I don't want to deal with.
No. Boys are absolutely impacted by this.
Yeah.
And of course, men are just to prevent the flood of comments about this. And of course, God, men are impacted too, because what the transgender ideology says is that if you have any sense of not being traditionally masculine, what it's telling young men is, and boys, if you have any sense that you don't fit into that masculine mold, then you must be transgender, which of course is a terrible, terrible thing to say, because, and just to prevent the flood of comments, I think that one of the bizarre things about this is that it's gender conforming. It's not gender fluid. So, having been somebody who has sort of, with my own boy children and with my own life, and it seems to me that the freer we can become a gender and the more tolerant we are of ourselves as human beings with manifold aspects of ourselves, not please boxing ourselves into these categories, the better. So I say that before I'm quite used to being attacked now.
Okay, so I just want us to back up just a little bit, because you said the word power several times when you were talking about Foucault and his kind of Marxist project, and like, how do we think about power? What is power? What is it? Is it collective agency? Is it kind of like why do people sign up for it? Why do people buy into it? Is there not something that they're getting back from it? Like, what is it? Is it a mode of exchange, a mode of behavior, a mode of agency?
Well, it's all of those things. And I think that it should be possible that we can imagine it and think about holding all the different aspects of it together. The trouble when you talk about power is people want to say, as you have just said, I know it was a good question. Is it that people are, manipulatively wanting to use it? Are people dupes? They just go along with it? Are some people getting pleasure out of it? It's all of those things. So it's important that we collectively analyze it. What I think we want to disavow is our own part in power. And I would like to bring that into the conversation, because in a way, power couldn't work if individuals didn't get some pleasure from being part of it, especially when we live in a liberal democracy, when we're told that there is no power, that we're all equal to each other, and that our governments work for us. Human beings in liberal democracies are very sensitive when they think that power is being imposed on them. And if you express any view that, in fact, it is being imposed and mobilized, people get very upset about it.
Well,
but they do, and that we participate in it.
Yeah, I don't want us to fall into the postmodern trap of infinitely deferring the meaning of power. If we're going to talk about something, I want it to have a stable definition, so we can actually build some sort of stable argument about it, and then link that up to patriarchy, link that up to group behavior, and then disentangle it afterwards.
Yeah. So what do you want?
So how does it manifest within patriarchy? Or how is there a male patterned powerness?
Okay, so I'll talk about my own experience then, because patriarchy has manifested in this trans ideology, in that what I can't talk about, but Bruce Jenner, and I don't mean to demonize Bruce Jenner or any public figure.
He's being canceled as we speak right now. He said that women shouldn't compete with men, or men shouldn't compete with women. And they're like,
I'm astonished at the way that people are imagining, and this is me being cynical, I'm astonished at the way people are imagining that he somehow had some sort of epiphany. Well, of course, what he needs to do is appeal to specific constituencies, because he's running for some political office. But anyway, So we could talk about Bruce Jenner. We could talk about anybody else. It doesn't matter. Let's remove it from Bruce Jenner. That men who identify as women are the only people who can talk about what it is like to be a woman. A woman, actually, myself and any other woman, if we use the language of our bodies, when I breastfed my babies, I was actually an adult human female doing it.
Yeah.
And somebody else is going to run along immediately and say, not all women breastfeed babies. Yeah. I'm so tired with all of this. But my point is that bizarrely, it's only men who are now allowed to talk about what it is to be a woman. If a woman talks about her body as being in any way significant to her life, and I think we live through our bodies are, to erase the body is ridiculous. To erase the body is doing the the service of patriarchy, as it were, and women are being asked to give up their language, to stop talking about their experiences, so that men can come in and have the space to talk about what the soul, the feminine soul, that they have. And so this is an old story just being replayed as we speak. And some women go along with it is astonishing, but that's a pretty old story as well. So carry on.
The trapdoor or the Trojan horse would be inclusive language. Inclusivity is kind of this shadow of democracy, or kind of an egalitarian.
Absolutely.
It's the process of egalitarianism taken to absurd degrees in certain cases. Yeah. We're going to abolish all categories, because categories in and of themselves restrain, they confine, they exploit, they allow for power to operate, which is the cynical kind of postmodern-ish kind of take on things. So what you do is you dismantle all the categories, but then what actually happens is that they're reinventing these categories on another level. Instead of dealing with the sex categories, they're dealing with the gender categories. Like I dropped that postmodern, or I ascribed that critique to postmodernism. But it seems like the smashing categories is inclusive, and then it ends up recreating these categories, like in this these reified categories of stereotype.
I don't know why you attribute that to postmodernism, because that idea of inclusivity is surely a product of liberal democratic discourse. Everyone is equal. It's got nothing to do with postmodernism. So let's just pull it back from that and say that, the logical consequence of liberal democracy is that we have to say everybody is equal, and we have to be inclusive of everyone. And of course, what has happened is the discourse around transgenderism is anything but inclusive. It's inclusive of men. It actually is exclusive of the experiences of children and women. It is a men's rights discourse, dressed up in the language of liberal democratic principles. And this is why we need to deconstruct them. Okay.
Well, then how do you go about properly deconstructing that move to colonize, let's just say within the transgender discourse, the colonization of the female by the male? How do you go about deconstructing that? And how do you diffuse the slings and arrows of infinite calls to bigotry, or assignations of bigotry that you're going to get along the way?
Yeah. Do you know, those are going to come anyway. I'm sick of them. So I just expect them. I'm not shocked by them. So they're going to come. So,
callous.
Right. So, sorry, Benjamin, let's just go back to your first point. How do you address the issue that in the language of inclusivity and diversity, what you have is a narrowing and an exclusion of women? The fact that women can demonstrate that girls are being excluded from sports scholarships, women have to stand on, the Olympic podiums with men getting gold medals. The fact that there are rapists who are in prisons, men who have committed rape and sexual abuse, who are now in women's prisons because they identify as women. You can provide all of this data. It's there. So it isn't a question of providing the data. The point is that people are inured to it. They don't care about it. Because ultimately, what has been established rhetorically is that men who identify as women are the most vulnerable category of all people. And if we don't go along with it, they are going to commit suicide, or younger people are going to commit suicide, and so on and so forth. So we have a situation on which women have to be kind, they have to be generous, men are just given an open door to walk into all women's spaces. And if a woman objects to it, she's just a bigot. How do we get out of that situation? I'm not sure. I'm having a pretty good bash at it, as are many other women. But to explain how that has happened, I think you do need a theory of patriarchy.
Oh.
And the trouble with that is, the minute you start to talk about it, people shut down. So they're quite happy to hear all kinds of things. They're quite happy to vilify Foucault and think of him as a demon and go along with that narrative. But the minute you start talking about patriarchy or that transgenderism is a men's rights movement, it's the women who talk about that who are set up as the sort of extremists, and the men who not only say they want to identify with women, and I don't care whether they do or whether they don't, but that they are actually women and they want the laws changed and social policy changed on the basis of that. That is not seen as extreme. So why is a woman objecting to that seen as an extremist, and the man who wants to do it is seen as a poor victim who just wants his human rights when nobody's taking his human rights away from him in the first place? So how do we think about that?
Yeah.
I would go back, not as a postmodernist, but as somebody who says power does operate. It absolutely operates, and we better realize it.
Okay.
It's just some theories of power are not acceptable, apparently.
Okay. 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 It goes back to power, and power has yet to be defined, other than, I guess, strictly exploiting something else or manipulating something in order to gain the advantage. Power is seen strictly, more or less, as advantage-seeking, privilege, hoarding pattern of behavior, some sort of agency corralling kind of thing that shapes discourse. How does it make sense to call this thing called power, which we haven't yet defined, patriarchy? Like, can you define what patriarchy is? Other than, are you perceiving that male pattern power seeking, collective male pattern power seeking? Is that what you're calling patriarchy? Is that what you're seeing? Is that what you're observing? Is that the phenomena? And then once we name it that, then what do we do with that? Or if that's what we're going to name it as.
I am saying that. Yeah. I'm not quite sure. You're quite rightly wanting to pin me down to a theory about what power is, but I note that you're wanting to pin me down to it, where I'm not quite sure whether you wanted to pin other people down to it. So people are talking about power all the time.
Yeah.
I'm being given the responsibility of a definitive analysis of it. So, okay, I'll go along with that, Benjamin.
Well, insofar as we can analyze this, we need to have the correct definitional tools. So sorry to put you on the spot.
We absolutely do. But
if patriarchy is going to hold water, we need a very sound definition of it.
I think that I've given you a sound definition of it, is what I'm trying to say. I think that the fact that this is impacting on women in every area of a woman's life, such that our language is even being policed, is sufficient demonstration that this is patriarchal. If you want me to find the source of it, the fat controller or the puppeteer, I won't be able to find this person because it's diffused throughout society. And as I said earlier, men and women participate in it at the very moment that they think that they're not doing it. So power is both operative from above and it's operative from below, in that as we take it up, and some of us will enjoy the power. And we probably need to have a psychoanalytic theory as well as to why a man might want to be a woman and both get lots of pleasure out of identifying as a woman and also wanting to hold on to a kind of masculinist power at the same time, which seems to me precisely what is actually happening at the moment. So I'm saying there's a multi-pronged analysis that needs to go on here. I'm not escaping answering your question. I'm saying that the kinds of question that you are asking is very important, and we need to have an open discussion about it. So this is the beginning. This isn't the end. If I could provide you with, the source of it, I would be ruling the world.
Okay, so yeah, right. Be careful what you wish for then. It seems to me that you could replace power with sexism or racism, and then you get modern political social justice. If you swap out the word power for those things, then again you have this strictly negative, exploitative system of controlling everybody, which I'm not saying doesn't exist, but once you start to have a bunch of people believe that, then you start to analyze their behavior, and they get more and more in a dark place, and they get more and more cynical. And then you have some pretty terrible group behavior that happens where people just go around destroying structures in other people's lives because they see everything as these power relationships, and that power is strictly negative, such as that power would be equal to racism or equal to sexism. So I just want to try to parse out a version of power that doesn't fall into that particular cynical trap.
I think I've been providing you with that. I think that I've said quite consistently that it is a complex thing, and I'm not opting out, and I'm not being postmodern when I say that. Absolutely not. I'm saying that it is complex, and it's become reduced to racism or sexism, for example. And sexism is if we stick with sexism, and of course I know the discourses are very connected at the moment between those who allege sexism and racism. But if you suggest that it's to do with sexism, what you're doing is, firstly, where does the sexism arise from? I mean, it's ridiculous to say sexism. If you're being sexist, it's coming from a prior discourse or power relationship. But what the problem with that is that it presents people as being either sexist or not. It induces what Foucault asked us not to do, in fact, which is to see people as being either villains or victims. And I'm saying we should pull back from that. We really should pull back from that. It's one of the most dangerous things that we do. Because then you get into a purist politics when you're either for them or against them, you're either this or you're that, when all of us are complexly, not in a postmodern way, but complexly involved in the many different interactions that are going on here. And I think that patriarchy is a much sounder word and theoretical concept to use than sexism. I mean, sexism, it's bizarre that people use the word sexism when sex apparently is something that we can't talk about. We could call it genderism or whatever, but it makes people feel guilty too for having certain thoughts or various ideas. It's much better for us to understand how we have become to understand ourselves in particular ways. I mean, I think that's fabulous. I never understand why it's not more taken up.
How about, I have a suggestion. How about we modify the term patriarchy and say, there's a word, I can't think of it right this instant, but like a distorted patriarchy. Maybe there is, if we have a full, well-rounded concept of patriarchy, not only as its misapprehension or its oppressive nature, which certainly you have male pattern power accumulation in group form that is very oppressive. You have that. But you also have very constructive forms of male pattern power acquirement and dispersal. So if we can see the male form of power, the male pattern form of power accrual and dispensing with as something that could go wrong, could be right, then we could say, how is it going wrong? How do we correct it? How do we channel? How do we understand men and their relationship to women, their relationship to sexuality, their relationship to power and to self-esteem and all that stuff, and then see that there are certain things that are out of whack in our society that are tilting more and more men into using the appropriation of women to hold on to something that probably isn't is probably maladaptive to begin with, is probably not necessarily in certain respects fulfilling for them, right? So in order not to fall into the trap of saying that patriarchy is just this negative boogeyman, this demiurge that's controlling us and that we have to be aware of and have to struggle against, we say that it is a pattern of human activity that goes off the rails when certain conditions aren't met, or when the men that are involved in it aren't forced to onto some sort of behavioral regimen. Is that acceptable? Is that useful, rather? Would that be a useful framework?
I think that you're asking me something that is important. I want to break it into two things. Firstly, you keep returning to this idea that I'm using patriarchy in a negative way that doesn't take account of the ways in which we're all, men as well as women, affected by it in ways that are not fruitful. I've said that a number of times now.
No, I just wanted to clarify in order for us to make the correct argument.
Okay. So let's just go back to this for the last time and not return to it again. That isn't the concept of patriarchy that I am using. Now, I'm aware that in the use of the term patriarchy, there is going to be an immediate knee-jerk reaction that in some sense, what the term does is it doesn't take account of the way that men are struggling with this. I think men want to kick back against the term immediately because they think that they're being blamed for something which they didn't initiate. They don't necessarily want it, and they don't understand that they're in relationships with women, they're brothers, and they have mothers and so on, and they don't relate to it, and they feel as if it's unfair to use the term. So this is the problem. So I'm very pleased you've addressed it. Again, it's something that we need to talk about and to bring out into the open so that we can have these kinds of discussions. So behind all of that, I think you're asking me something. I'm not quite sure what you're asking. So if I can just frame it in a way that I think you're asking it, is that you're saying patriarchy is a difficult term. How is it that we can begin to think about it as a term whilst bringing men into the conversation rather than shutting them out? Is that what you're asking me?
That's a good question. That's a really good question, because it has been used or abused in a way to ascribe a bunch of implicit power to men, and that shuts them down. Just like the term white supremacy is used. It's like, oh, absolutely. You didn't choose to do this, but you're white, so therefore you're racist,
Yeah.
You know. You didn't choose to be a man, but you are, so therefore sexist, right? So in order to avoid that, we just need to shore up, because that's how it has been used, abused, and then recycled.
Yeah.
Infinitely.
So thanks for that. I suppose that what I'm wanting to do is to bring it back into the conversation, because I can't think of any other term to use for what's going on at the moment to women. The transgender movement is so impacting on women in the way that it's not impacting on men. What other term can we use? Let's think of a new term. I think that I'm prepared to, if we take racism, for example, I'm prepared to accept that I have advantages as a white person that, I don't know whether it's unconscious actually, because I think I've done quite a good job on myself as being conscious of the various ways that I think about things. I think I'm happy to accept that as a white person I have political advantages I'm not going to beat myself up about it, though. I didn't initiate it. I don't want it. And I don't think that all white people are bad, and I don't think that all black people are good. So equally, I would like to have a more subtle conversation about that. When it gets down to this idea that we all have to flagellate ourselves for past thought crimes or actual material crimes of our ancestors, I think we can bring it into the discourse, but I would refuse to flagellate myself in relation to it. And I expect men to refuse to flagellate themselves when the word patriarchy is used. Can we please be grown-ups about this? It's possible to think through the consequences of the different hierarchical power relationships and how they operate at the moment without having to demonize. So I suppose if anything, what I want to do at the moment, my own bugbear, is the way that everything is demonized. Everybody is demonized, including Foucault or postmodernists or whatever. I'm calling for a much more complex analysis of everything, and at the same time, having a refusal. Let's all of us refuse to be dragged into a simplistic version of society where there are good people and bad people, and where we have to police our own thoughts all of the time, or we don't dare to say anything. Let's dare to say things, all of us. So I invite men who refuse the term patriarchy to tell me they refuse the term patriarchy and why, and getting into a discussion with me rather than cancelling the discussion. Let's have the discussion.
You said, and this is another question to kind of go back to like first Foucaultian principles. You said you don't want us to be in a world where we're always questioning ourselves and policing our thoughts. And this is one problem where I can see Foucault going wrong, is that he said, and you've repeated this several times, that as soon as you think that you're not aware or that you're transparent or that you're clean or clear, being authentic, that's when you should start questioning. So I think it was Ricoeur who coined the term, what is it? I'm going to have to go back and look it up. But like Nietzsche and Foucault and Karl Marx, they're always, or maybe it's Freud, not Foucault, because Ricoeur was talking about older thinkers. But that constant cynicism, that constant skepticism, always like inserting and impending upon yourself, where you're never actually free to be authentic. Because the moment that you feel you're authentic is the moment when you have to disrupt and problematize. And I can see that without some sort of counter principle of just relaxing and just being authentic for the sake of just like not caring whether you're authentic or not, then you're always going to be interrupted. And I think that move towards always problematizing things is part of the problem that we're in now, because now it's just turned up and add some moral authority to it. Now you have people going around canceling each other and going through and picking each other apart because there's no place for us to be relaxed. There's no place for us to not care if we're being authentic or not. We can just be nice and not be manipulative, right? So I just wonder, like, is there a counter principle to keep Foucault's problematizations in check?
Well, you're presuming by saying that it's a kind of Foucauldian problematization. I don't think it is. I think it's something that as conscious human beings we're impelled to do about our human existence, whether we're living in post-modernity, modernity or pre-modernity, is what human beings do. We make meaning and we have to reflect upon the meaning that we make, because the meaning that we make has consequence. So that's one answer to your question. In terms of the authentic self, I don't think Foucault has led me to question my authentic self. Hang on a sec, I'd like to go back on that. I don't think that Foucault is responsible for the fact that I and other women are currently constantly having to monitor ourselves, defend ourselves, not be happy in our bodies. I have had very embodied experiences as the adult human female and as a child human female, which I would quite like to be relaxed about. I'd quite like to own without being accused of being a biological essentialist. I've enjoyed having a female body. I've given birth from my female body and all kinds of experiences from my female body, which I am being policed from saying. And it's not Foucault that's led me down that route. Absolutely, it's not. Mm-hmm. The only route that Foucault has led me down in relation to my embodied experience is to be aware that, I think that we have embodied experiences, but they're never pure, and that our embodiment is always caught up in the particular historical society that we live in, and we live our bodies through gender, through social gender. Men do too. But nevertheless, there's something very grounding about the body. It brings us back to ourselves. To throw away the body and to say that it has no significance whatsoever, to me, is the most appalling thing that's happening at the moment. So I want to return to our embodied experiences. That's an anchor for me. Yeah. And I just want to reiterate again, it's not Foucault that's destabilizing that at all for me.
I just well stated, and I agree that the path towards the way out is getting back to a more humble understanding of what it is to be a human being, which is basically an animal with language tacked onto it. I was wondering if okay, so it seems like there's, and please help me with this. So Socrates walking around in some garden back in the day, he's like, the unexamined life is not worth living, right? And then people are like, oh, let's start examining things. What is this life? What is the good? What is true? What are these animal things? What's the stars? And all that examination happens. There seems to be something different between examining your life and problematizing your life, or problematizing things. And I just wonder, that word problematization, it's got a bad rap, and you can't stop things from being malabused or disabused of their high meaning. But there does seem to be something like where you're making problems out of things rather than trying to bring something to light. And I just wonder how Foucault or postmodernism has contributed to a society where we're problematizing things, where we're criticizing things, and how maybe that is a misattribution to Foucault, where he wasn't actually doing that. He was trying to make subtle points, not necessarily tear every power structure apart, but just get a better understanding of what was going on.
Right, I'm going to work from the last point you made backwards, as it were. You've said a number of times that Foucault was trying to tear power structures apart as if this was something destructive. So I don't.
Vivisection, then?
I don't think he was doing any of that. I think that he was just saying that power is always operative, and let's just be aware of it and examine it. And, it's what we're all doing all the time. Whatever, there is local elections going on in my country at the moment. People are talking about the different political parties. How do we analyze them? What do they mean when they say this or that? We're all aware that power is operative all the time. And he just gives you different kinds of tools in order to think about that power. So, the fantasy of liberal democracy is that we will live in this context in which power isn't operative and we can all live happily as equals. And it isn't going to happen, because that's not the human condition. And he was just pointing out the human condition. But let's leave that now and go back to your other point about the unexamined life and about what consciousness does to human beings. Well, probably being conscious, the more conscious you are, probably in some senses, the more unhappy you are. I don't know, you had a little cat that you put outside of the room. Your cat has no conception that he or she is going to die, for example. Will not reflect upon herself in any way whatsoever. Is her life or his life better or happier than ours as human beings who have consciousness, intelligence? I don't know the answer to that, but I think that human beings are sometimes so brutalized, and still currently in the 21st century, so brutalized they don't have a moment to reflect upon themselves. Is that a happier condition to be in? I don't know the answer to that. But I do think that if we become conscious of the conditions of our own existence, it feels that if I talk about myself, it feels that I'm manifesting myself as a human being more, the more conscious that I am. So there are pleasures in that too. The more I reflect, the more I use my intelligence, the more human I become. So I don't think this is, let's stop putting this into this bag of postmodernism. We've got to stop doing this. We're demonizing something. We are constantly human beings in a state of flux. Historically, we have. We're always moving forward, or moving somewhere, whether it's to a higher place or not. We're constantly using our intelligence about it. There will be different paradigms of thought all the time. Sometimes we get fixed in paradigms of thought. We can't imagine thinking in a different way. Then something happens and we do. It seems to me that what we're talking about is the human condition. And you could say that it's thoroughly miserable because consciousness is probably the biggest curse that we have. And we could go back to stories of Adam and Eve almost to explain this. Yeah. All I'm asking is, let's not be so simplistic that we're going to relate it back to postmodernism as the sort of source of, Eve or Adam ate the apple at that moment in time. And this is the consequence of it.
Yeah, very fair. One more thing, it's just a small question. He said that liberal democracy is a fantasy, according to Foucault. Like, is there something better than liberal democracy? Who said
that? Sorry.
You said that there's a fantasy within liberal democracy that we're all going to be equal and power won't exist anymore. What is a better, more realistic governing strategy for human beings with all of their messy, power-hungry, manipulative, cynical behaviors going on?
I'm going to point something out, Benjamin. I think that what you're doing is you're thinking, if there is any critique of liberal democracy, then there must be a solution, another kind of way that we can think that we would organize ourselves better. It's possible to critique liberal democracy without thinking there's another system somewhere. If we could just find it, we should use that. Okay. This isn't what I'm saying. And clearly, if we go back to the Pluckrose and Lindsay book, which is where we started, which is probably where we should also end, that their fantasy that somehow, if these postmodernists just didn't get in the way, and if we didn't just problematize everything, if we just understood ourselves as agents of our own lives and we would compromise and tolerate each other, fantastic, I'm all for that. But if we did that, somehow liberal democracy would just work. What I'm saying is it's an unworkable political paradigm in that there are always going to be problems with it, but it's probably the best one. It's possible to accept that it's the best possible political regime we have. I'm very happy to live a liberal democracy. Please God, especially as a woman. I want to live in a liberal democracy. But it's possible for me to have numerous thoughts that in my mind all at the same time. The fact that I want to live in a liberal democracy doesn't mean that I can't also think there are some problems with it, and I want to reflect upon those problems in order to bring the ideal of liberal democracy back to its practice in material life. And at the same time, I don't think it's going to bring nirvana. I don't think there's ever going to be a point at which liberal democracy will eradicate power if these postmodernists would just go away or whoever.
Yeah.
It's simply, possibly maybe our human condition or human nature isn't that perfect, and we'll always be negotiating around people who want some power and those people who have power exercised over them, and try and put into liberal democratic democracies the checks and balances to mitigate against that, without at the same time bringing about the most autocratic elements and authoritarian elements into liberal democracy that I've certainly seen in my lifetime in the name of democracy. So this is why we need to critically think. There is vast swathes of people going along with the idea that this is about progress and freedom, when in fact it's constricting us. It's doing the panopticon. It's not just constricting our external freedoms, it's constricting what we can actually think. And surely the ideal of liberal democracy is that we can talk, we can disagree, we have a public space in which we can argue with one another. And it's this that's going to cement the ideals of liberal democracy, not, and I'm preaching to the converted here, not the converse.
So I guess, no, thank you for the clarification. The practice of arguing and being liberal and being free-spirited is probably like the most practical micro action one can do. Micro activism, perhaps, to actually have conversations, disagree.
Absolutely.
So what's coming up next for you? Do you have a scholarly monograph in the works, or a book coming out, or a series of lectures you're going to be posting?
I've got numerous things that I'm doing at the moment. The thing that is most significant, I'm writing chapters for various books, and I have a journal article which should be coming out hopefully any day now, the journal Dignity, which is an American journal.
What's that article?
It's about the ways in which, for those people who may or may not know about it, that there was a judicial review of the practice of giving puberty blockers to children at the Tavistock Hospital. That was regarded, that the judgment was that it wasn't appropriate, that children couldn't consent to it, and there's an appeal against that now. So the interesting thing is, as an alleged postmodernist, what I'm arguing, which I'm not, what I'm arguing is that it's postmodern theory which has led to the practices at the Tavistock, and that the appeal that's taking place is based on postmodern theory, and we should throw it out the window. So that's what my article is about. So there's that. But just before we stop talking, the interesting thing is that I'm giving a paper to plastic surgeons in September. And I think that this is quite significant, that finally the body of plastic surgeons has asked me to their annual conference to talk about what I'm giving a paper on, phalloplasty, and the lack of medical ethics in plastic surgeons
constructing genitalia.
Constructing genitalia. alleged genitalia. And really, young women's bodies are devastated from this.
Yeah, it's not a pretty thing.
So that's what I'm doing in September. So
busy.
Yeah.
Are you teaching on top of it?
I'm not teaching anymore. I'm writing and giving talks.
There you go. You don't have to deal with those pesky undergraduates anymore.
Although I'm writing a chapter for undergraduates at the moment for a reader, a Routledge reader, about the history of sex and gender since the 19th century. So I'm aware that as I'm writing, the undergraduates who, young kids and young people are so convinced that there's no other way of experiencing freedom, bodily freedom, other than through the trans lens, which is so pernicious and so constricting.
It's very small. It's very small of all the things that you could be doing with your body.
All the things of the most destructive things. And of course, it drowns out every other area of their life. I mean, this obsession, again, we could go back to Foucault, this idea, this obsession that we've had an obsession with sexuality and now an obsession with gender. It's as if there's nothing else in the world. You understand? God, the restriction of it, the narrowness of it, and if it brought happiness, if these children were freed, well, I would be all for it. But it's a closing in of life. It's a narrowing of everything down to some internal chimera which doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So
but it's got sparkles and plenty of colors. Well, thank you, Heather, for your evening. I hope that your week is going to be very productive. And how do I pronounce Brunskell or Brunskell?
It's Brunskell. Brunskell-Evans. Yeah.
I didn't see an umlaut, but I didn't know if you wanted me to put one in there. I could, if you want. Brunskell. Like some sort of Scottish guy. No, okay. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
I'll end the recording there. And wait, no. Over here. Congratulations for reaching the end of the discussion. If you enjoyed it, do be sure to leave a review or a comment or a thumbs up or whatever you need to do to show that glorious algorithm that this is some good stuff. And do be sure to go and check that back catalog, as it is brimming full of fantastic conversations. Links to provide monetary support are down there in the description as well. Have a good night.